Soviet punk Yegor Letov had just spent 3 months locked up in a Soviet mental asylum for the creation of music with anti-Soviet lyricism. They had attempted to break him, force him to conform to the system. They had, however, failed. Yegor Letov's first instinct after finally being released from the asylum was to write and release a song about Lenin rotting in his mausoleum. This cemented Letov as one of the USSR's most fearless musicians, somebody who would stop at nothing to revolt against the system he was subjected to. The idea that any form of punk or anti-establishment music could exist during the Soviet Union may seem completely alien. Before Gorbachev eased censorship in the mid-80s, it was almost impossible to create art that didn't entirely conform to the ideology of communism. Music created in the West, as well as music created within the USSR that wasn't endorsed by the state, was distributed entirely through illegally pirated flexi-disc vinyls traded under the noses of the militia. This practice was known as magnitizdat. It would be this practice that first introduced Letov to Western music at a young age, as his brother would occasionally be responsible for creating pirated copies of albums banned in the USSR intended for underground sale and trading. The consumption of Western music within the Soviet Union at the time was almost impossible. It involved either traveling to a specific location to tune into an American radio station focusing on propaganda and the promotion of Western music, or just be lucky enough to receive a bootleg vinyl containing a Western album and just pray to God that it's not the Beatles. The vinyls traded were of course not traditional format, and instead came in the form of flexi discs, with bootlegs being printed on old X-ray film. This allowed the bendy discs to be stored anywhere and easily hidden. This was vital, as the underground trade of what was essentially banned material came with many risks. Upon exploring Letov's childhood, it's easy to see why the two brothers became involved in the illegal trade of music. Yegor Letov was born in Omsk, one of the major Siberian cities, in 1964. His family would move to Kazakhstan early in Letov's life, although this would prove detrimental to him and his older brother, as the area in which they moved routinely saw nuclear testing, with the Soviets just fucking chucking nukes in the air and hoping they'd explode just to see what would happen. This resulted in Letov and his brother having severe health issues from a young age, with Letov even being pronounced clinically dead multiple times. It was clear to his parents that it was extremely unlikely Letov would live past teenagehood, and despite the fact his parents both worked for the state as a military officer and doctor, they allowed Letov to essentially do whatever he wanted. He spent his early childhood inside the library at his house, exploring his parents' vast book collection, specifically becoming passionate about poetry. This artistic flair would extend to school. He was described as an average student, although excelled when it came to music, picking up the guitar as a teenager. The lack of parental intervention and time spent trading illegal records had clearly inspired Letov's older brother, as he would move to Moscow, becoming a fairly successful jazz saxophonist within the city. Shortly after graduating, Letov joined his older brother in Moscow and quickly built connections with underground avant-garde artists, which inspired him to pick up more instruments, such as drums and bass guitar, like a true rhythm Chad. Despite his interest and obvious talent, he decided to treat music as a hobby and instead join a construction school in Moscow, specifically focusing his efforts on plastering, whilst writing short stories and poetry in his free time. 2 years after enrolling in the school, Letov would return to Siberia and decided to focus his entire effort on the creation of music. At the time, he was inspired by free jazz and rock in opposition, the latter essentially being rock music that opposed the music industry, mainly because said industry failed to recognize their music. The modern day equivalent would be 15-year-old trap producers who advertise on Instagram Reels and share Alex Jones edits. His early recordings would be extremely low quality, being described by Letov as talentless curiosity, although I believe the issue was more a lack of equipment than lack of talent, as Letov literally used old suitcases as opposed to a traditional drum kit. He continued to explore various styles of music and eventually was able to find contemporaries that listened to the same music as him. This was extremely rare, as any form of heavier rock music was very unpopular in the entirety of the USSR, let alone just Siberia. Letov, alongside these individuals, decided to form the garage rock band Possev in 1982. Possev translates to sowing crops or seeds and originated from a Russian anti-white emigrants group. This group essentially consisted of Russians who emigrated from the former Russian Empire during the Russian Revolution. They aren't overly relevant to the story. All you need to know is they were extremely anti-communist. Despite the band name being outwardly political and essentially anti-communist during the reign of the Soviet Union, the band wasn't actually political at the time, with Letov stating how the name was just the most shocking thing he could think of. The band would release 11 albums, although broke up due to creative burnout. Despite the band breaking up, Letov would meet Konstantin Ryabov, who would become his best friend and right-hand man for many years. Possev essentially morphed into Grazdanska Obrona in 1984. The name translates to civil defense, although is most commonly shortened to Grob, which translates to coffin. I will be referring to the band as Grob from now on, so I can avoid short wiring my brain after being forced to pronounce Grazdanska Obrona multiple times throughout this video. The band became much more political than their predecessor, with each lyric being extremely anti-authoritarian and directly criticizing the Soviet Union. The mother of the guitarist at the time was a party official for the Soviet Union, and upon hearing the music immediately presented it to the KGB, stating how her son was involved in an anti-Soviet organization. This quickly resulted in severe punishment for the band, with Ryabov being forced into military service despite suffering from a heart condition, and Letov being taken into custody. He was charged with planning a terrorist attack on an oil refinery and immediately sent to jail. Whilst in jail, Letov exhibited worrying behavior, the likes of which I can't mention on YouTube without saying sewer or slide. This resulted in him being forcibly sent to a mental asylum. During his time inside the asylum, the workers intended to essentially lobotomize him with the use of strong neuroleptics, which are drugs used to treat psychosis. As described by Letov, the first strong dose resulted in intense feelings of restlessness, as if he needed to utilize all his strength and mobility to avoid uncontrollable violent convulsing. Despite avoiding the convulsions, the medication made Letov temporarily blind. He described the experience as facing death. He claimed to have witnessed individuals turning into animals, screaming and biting at staff members before being tied down to the bed and eventually broken down, resulting in an individual who was soft, compliant, and unlikely to revolt against the system ever again. Fortunately, Letov avoided this fate, and upon release, 3 months after being hospitalized, became more outspoken and political than ever before. He began writing songs that reflected resistance, not just against the USSR, but any social system that may attempt to subjugate a person. He had essentially survived political prison, and the last thing he wanted to do was give up any of his creative freedom, so decided to construct a small recording studio inside his own apartment. This became Grob Records, and subsequently became home to many of Siberia's most notable punk bands. Punk was beginning to flourish within the USSR. The public had become sick of the outdated state-sponsored music and were hungry for change. Due to the USSR not reflecting the trends in terms of their sponsored music, the underground tape trading culture became more prominent throughout the USSR. This was the main way in which Grob's music was traded, leading to the band building an underground cult following. At the time, Letov would record primarily on his own, with any collaborators being credited under fake names and aliases. Letov was still very much in dispute with the Soviet system, meaning any association with him came at a huge risk. Even the former members of Grob had signed agreements promising to stay away from Letov entirely. Despite building popularity, Grob had made very little money. The lack of commercial viability alongside Soviet limits on what small businesses were able to trade limited their success massively. In 1987, Letov was invited to attend the Novosibirsk Rock Festival in Siberia. He wasn't originally going to play any music, although after another musician no-showed, he was convinced to do so. Letov joined forces with other musicians attending the festival and played a set under a name that, again, I cannot say on YouTube. I'll give you a hint though, a very infamous German name that has rarely seen a usage as baby names since the 1940s. Before returning home, Letov caught wind that the authorities were attempting to put him in the asylum again. He immediately left the city alongside his partner partner and hitchhiked throughout the USSR for over a year. During this time frame, he was still able to release various bootleg tapes and performed at enough shows to make enough money to survive. After continuous appeals from his family towards the KGB, the persecution ended and Letov returned home. Upon returning to his home studio, Letov immediately got to work, releasing 6 albums across 2 years and embarking on a tour across the USSR with Grob. The 3 albums released in 1989 are the most prominent in my opinion. Falling under the genres noise rock and industrial, the music utilized darker and more elaborate lyricism, focusing on Siberian folklore and pre-Christian beliefs. A long-haired musician becoming obsessed with their country's folklore, I'm sure nothing can go wrong. Grob would break up in 1990 after playing their final show in Tallinn. Letov feared that the project would turn quote-unquote pseudo-counterculture and subsequently ended it entirely. Not long after the original split of Grob, the Soviet Union would fall. This allowed musicians to express themselves freely, although at times resulted in lack of motivation or political drive for many former USSR punks. Although Letov had distanced himself from music, he became more political than ever before, although his new stance seemed to completely oppose the views he had presented previously through his music. In the early 90s, Letov became one of the founders of the National Bolshevik Party. The party pushed both radical left and right-wing ideologies with a focus on nationalism, Stalinism and communism. The term Bolshevik was originally used to describe members of a section of the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party, which was originally run by Vladimir Lenin, which is extremely ironic considering one of Letov's earlier songs describes Lenin rotting in his mausoleum. The party essentially intended to combine Bolshevik communism with ultra-nationalism. Regardless of your political opinion, it's clear the National Bolshevik Party is a far cry politically from what Letov had been preaching in the past, with many speculating that his desire to consistently oppose the status quo led him to return to communism ideology after the fall of the Soviet Union. Letov would leave the party a few years later and completely distance himself from politics. Grob would reform in 1994, although ditched much of its punk and noise rock roots, instead deciding to produce more psychedelic and shoegaze styles. The music became brighter and more optimistic. If the mission statement for Grob in the 80s was violence against the system, the message post-1994 definitely focused more so on peace and just making good wah-wah music. Between the 24th of March and the 10th of June 1999, NATO carried out a 2-week and 3-day long bombing of Serbia, with the intent being to end what they saw as an cleansing of Albanians. The bombings resulted in hundreds of civilian deaths and predated the Grob US tour by only a few months. Various members of the band saw the United States as enemy territory, with their guitarist flat out refusing to attend the tour. The band would attend the tour regardless, and during their New York stop, Letov made a speech declaring that the US will have to answer for Serbia. This encouraged concert attendees to flood the streets, waving Soviet, Russian and Serbian flags. They were quickly broken up by the police, with the tour manager running away with the rest of the money shortly after this incident. Upon returning, the band had a few lineup changes as a result of one member leaving due to personal reasons and another falling out of his apartment window after a heavy night of drinking. By the early 2000s, Russia's infrastructure had changed dramatically, especially in regards to music. Concerts were now being held in clubs and stadiums as opposed to previously state-run centers and cinemas. This allowed counterculture to come to the forefront of the Russian mainstream, resulting in renewed interest for Grob, who was seen as Soviet-themed nostalgia. They took advantage of this, routinely playing a more psychedelic rock style of music throughout Russia. Although Letov had planned to continue to create and release music throughout the late 2000s, he would unfortunately pass away due to cardiac arrest in 2008 at the age of 43. In the years since his death, Letov's wife has continued to put out unreleased recordings, with the music and story of Letov becoming iconic for people in and outside of Russia. His music has seen various tributes in the years since his death, most prominently from trip-hop legends Massive Attack. He even had a motherfucking Vietnamese beetle named after him. That beetle looks like this and is pretty sick if you ask me. In 2019, Grob reformed to celebrate the band's 35th anniversary. Letov was replaced by various long-time collaborators and friends. Their last show took place on the 23rd of February 2020, with Letov Letov's longtime right-hand man, Ryabinov, dying from a stroke several weeks later. When exploring the life and career of Yegor Letov, it's hard to ignore the clear and obvious contradictions he consistently made throughout his life. Whether it be his public political statements or style of music he made, it seems he continuously wanted to go against the grain of society, even if that meant completely contradicting himself. During his stint within the National Bolshevik Party, he appeared to be inconsistent and unpredictable. According to founder Limonov, he routinely returned to punk solitude, claiming he didn't even know what the party was or what they stood for, before then returning to align with them. Regardless of what his alignment with the party consisted of, it still completely contradicted his previous statements made within his music. Much like the vast majority of early punk icons, it's best to view them as individuals who intended to push back against the authority that they felt was limiting their lives and beliefs, as opposed to an individual to look towards or follow for their political opinions. And the fact that Yegor Letov did this during the reign of the Soviet Union and continued to do so despite being locked up in a mental asylum and almost becoming blind is admirable in itself. Imagine if Sid Vicious got locked up and fed neuroleptics, although to be fair, knowing him, it's extremely likely he would have enjoyed taking the neuroleptics.